As you know, we were gone last week. Linda and I visited family. And I want to say I appreciated Rick preaching last week in my absence. We're glad to be back. We were back Wednesday for the class. We're back today. We're good to be back working with you again. The subject today is one that is very familiar, just in one word: excuses. Rick was dealing with a very sensitive subject in Bible class. This is a sensitive subject, except not dealing with sexual immorality, but it's kind of sensitive to start talking about our excuses. But making excuses is a universal human tendency. It just is. We learn early, and we learn to perfect and become very efficient in making excuses. And sometimes there are things that happen to us in our life that tends to have a force upon us to make us more of an excuse maker. And really, to be honest, that's kind of what COVID has been. A lot of things happen to us that have that tendency. But COVID has had some problems and caused some problems. Some that are very obvious and very visible, and some that are not so much. And one of the ones for me personally, and perhaps for you as well, has been causing more of a tendency to make excuse, to become an excuse maker. Now, I want to begin our thinking in the right direction on this and ask you, what do you think at this point, just off the top of your head? Do you think making an excuse is a good thing or a bad thing? How you think about that is determining how you conduct yourself in relationship to excuses in your life. But I'd like for us to consider a definition of what an excuse is. That's where we have to start. Basically, an excuse is a pretext. That is an invented or a made-up reason for not doing something in order to remove accountability, or in order to save face, or that could be expanded in a lot of different ways. But this is kind of a kernel, concise explanation of what an excuse is. It's an invented reason. It's a made-up reason for not doing something because we don't want to be seen as guilty. We don't want to be less thought of. We don't want to be accountable. And so we invent or we make up reasons for not being or not doing something. And so looking at that from that point of view kind of helps us get going in the right direction. And when you look at it, okay, is it a Bible subject? It certainly is a Bible subject. When I consider all the subjects we've addressed over the last year and a half related to somehow helping us get through the COVID pandemic, to try to encourage and strengthen us, at first it may not seem like this is one of those relevant subjects, but it really is. It's a Bible subject. And you will find excuses in the Old Testament, and you will find excuses in the New Testament. And we're going to look at both sources. But as we look at this what an excuse is then is something that is made in the absence of a justifiable reason. I'll use myself as an example. I find myself in this situation more than I would like. But someone comes to me and says, "Lynn, why didn't you do what you were supposed to do?" Okay, I may have a justifiable reason. I was sick. I was in the hospital. I had car trouble. Something happened to prevent, and that's prevented me. That's a justifiable reason. Or if I didn't have that, then I could come over here and start making something up. Inventing something that'll make me sound good or avoid displeasure. And so an excuse is made in the absence of, when we don't have a justifiable reason. But as we look at excuses in the Bible, one of the statements that is found in the New Testament. Lord addresses this subject. In Luke chapter 14, he addresses excuses. And in verse 18, for now, this is what he said, but they all alike began to make excuses. So we're going to talk about that in just a minute. Who's he talking about? What does he mean they began to make excuses? Was that pleasing to him or not? And those are questions that every good Bible student and someone who wants to be pleasing to God wants a Bible answer to. So let us go from this to what we will call, first of all, looking at the Old Testament. When I look at the Old Testament, you read the Old Testament, we have a number of examples of excuses. King Saul, Judah in captivity. We could go down the list. But I've chosen one. Well, this one is perhaps one of the clearest, most vivid lessons about excuse making, and it's from an individual that you wouldn't expect. Who would expect Moses to be an example of making excuses? When we think of Moses making excuses, I have the passages, and if you want to read those with me, we'll read those in just a moment. We start in Exodus, the 3rd chapter, and go from there to Exodus, the 4th chapter, and verse 1 and verse 10. But when Moses made excuses, please keep in mind, he's not a young man. He makes excuses when the Lord appears to him in the burning bush, at the mountain of God, at Mount Horeb, at Mount Sinai. Moses is 80 years old. Moses was raised for 40 years in the house of Pharaoh, as Pharaoh's daughter's adopted son. And so at the end of 40 years, we know that by Stephen's statement in Acts chapter 7, he gives us some chronology on this. He fled Egypt. And for the next 40 years, he was married, had children. He was a shepherd of his father-in-law, Jethro, in the land of Midian. And by Exodus, the 3rd chapter, we find him at Mount Sinai. Kind of prophetic in a way. But at the beginning of this passage, God is appearing to him in the burning bush. He draws Moses in by Moses seeing this bush burning, but it's not being consumed. And he's told, Moses, you're standing on holy ground. Take those shoes off. And God begins to speak to him. And he tells him, I've heard of the affliction of my people in Egypt. I've heard their cries. I have decided I will deliver them out of that Egyptian bondage. And I have chosen you to do that. You're the one that I want to go to Egypt and lead my people out of that Egyptian bondage. Moses was not ready to do that. In fact, when we look at chapter 3 and verse 11, his first statement, his first response, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and that I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt? In other words, this is the way Moses saw himself. Remember, he had been there for 40 years. He had the best education there was in Egypt. He had all the wealth and riches that were available in this kingdom and all the advantages. And he fled, and he had 40 years of training in the wilderness around Mount Sinai in the land of Midian. But at this point, God said, I want you to go. And he can't. And his excuse at this would be expressed like we sometimes say and feel about ourselves, a feeling of inferiority. Who am I to do that? There are people better than me. There are people more important than me. I'm not qualified to do that. Well, obviously God thought he was. This was not a justifiable reason. Moses is making up a reason why he thought he should not have to do this. Well, God answered this, and it's an interesting, I encourage you to read the entirety of this passage sometime to get every word that was spoken on this occasion. But after God had spoken to him, he came back with another statement in chapter 4 and verse 1. After God telling him, I'll be with you, there'll be signs. But then Moses answered and said, what if they will not believe me or listen to what I say? For they may say, the Lord has not appeared to you. So Moses is thinking ahead and anticipating some things that are thought might be, and how easy it is for any of us to do that. It might happen. Maybe. And so what he said, what if they will not believe me? For they may say. In other words, Moses is saying, I can't do that because I'm concerned about rejection. They'll not believe me. They'll not accept what I am doing. And so another of Moses' excuses is his concern for being rejected by the very people he goes to deliver. And then this continues. God answers and responds that. And this is when the staff enters the picture. And that's some interesting, vivid imagery. Moses had a staff, and God asked him, what is that in your hand? And staff, throw it on the ground. It became a serpent. Pick it up. It became a rod again. So that staff became very significant in Moses' life and work. And then he told him to put his hand in his side. And he pulled it out, and it was totally leprous. Told him to put it back, and it was clean again. Moses, I will be with you. My power will guide you. My power will guard you. Well, Moses had another response. In chapter 4 and verse 10, Moses said to the Lord, please, Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither recently or in time past, not since thou hast spoken to thy servant, for I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. Now that statement from him is hard to recognize. That's not the word that I want to say. Hard to reconcile with some other things we know about him. But this is what he said on this occasion in response to this request of God. And of course, this is not a justifiable reason. God thought he could do it, but Moses didn't think. So he had to make up a reason, and the reason he made up is just, I don't have the ability. In fact, if you're going to need someone that can really talk and talk well and be eloquent, and that's not me. Thy servant, for I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. Stephen said in his speech in Acts 7, he was mighty in words. So there are some things that perhaps it changed. You can imagine when he was a 4-year-old, powerful son of Pharaoh leaving Egypt, how he must have changed over 40 years of being disciplined by the severity of the wilderness and being a shepherd of sheep. Perhaps. But what we find in Moses' life, we have in the Old Testament 3 excuses that are very typical of human beings that are still made today. Moses made these excuses when God said, you're the one, I'm picking you, I want you to go. And so how are these still made today? Well, let's ask some questions in general to all of us, any of us. Why aren't you stepping up and being more zealous in serving the Lord? Why not? You have a justifiable reason. Why can't you be counted on to help carry the load here? Why aren't you trying harder to make disciples and build up the church and help the church advance? Why don't you put faith over fear during difficult times? What COVID has done has had a tendency to force us, to push us into putting fear over faith. Now, that's not to dismiss caution. That's not to dismiss any effort to take care of ourselves. But if we're not careful, we can be pushed too far and begin to have further than a justifiable reason and have to start making excuse. And so we need to always put faith over fear during difficult times, not just during COVID, but any time we have a personal problem, we have a family problem, and sometimes it's fear, it's being afraid, it's being hesitant, it's being doubtful that takes precedence over faith. Faith should always take precedence over whatever it is that would diminish us. So Moses stood on Mount Sinai at the burning bush and invented reasons why he could not do what God asked him to do. And by Exodus chapter 4, and I think it's verse 11 or 12, the anger of God was kindled against him. God was mad. So if we begin to think that you and I can stand at the burning bush today, figuratively speaking, and God's saying, I want you, and I expect this of you, and we start making up, I don't feel I'm the one, or they'll not like me if I do this in public, or I just don't feel I have the ability, I don't have the training, and we start making whatever it may be. These are very general. We can expect God accepts none of them. None of these are a justifiable reason. Now, there will be justifiable reasons. I'm not dismissing that. But we have to be careful. Sometimes there's that fine line that we talk about between a justifiable reason and an excuse. And that's where we each have to work out our own salvation with fear and trembling. And the reason for fear and trembling is because of accountability. I want to go to heaven. I don't want to be forced and pressured into doing something that displeases God. Okay? And you don't either. Well, let's turn our attention from the Old Testament. We could look at those other examples, but what we see in Moses is typical and exemplary for today. And so when we look at excuses in the New Testament, those that made excuses were what we will call invited guests. For this passage, I invite your attention to Luke chapter 14 and verse 15 through verse 24. It was upon this occasion at the beginning of Luke 14 when he, that is the Lord, went into the house of one of the rulers of the Pharisees on a Sabbath to eat bread, and they were watching him, trying to catch him, trap him. And upon this occasion, he taught several lessons. He taught priority in seating. He taught, beginning at verse 12, of extending the invitation to others than just your friends. But verse 15 is where he starts talking about this. And it's in this dialogue of teaching on this parable that is sometimes called the slightest invitation or other things, that he begins to talk about excuses. So let's look at the passage. Here's what he said. He said to him, a certain man was giving a big dinner. This is the New American Standard Bible. And he invited many, and at the dinner hour he sent his slave to say to those who had been invited, come, for everything is ready now. But they all alike began to make excuses. This is the way the Lord brings excuses into his teaching. He used this opportunity to talk about this certain man who was giving a feast or a big dinner and sending out invitations. This was the rule, the way it was done. We're having a feast. The guests were invited. They knew they were coming. They had already accepted the invitation. The dinner is prepared, and the slave goes out again and said, okay, it's ready. Time to come. And that's what the Lord is talking about here. But at the beginning of verse 18, they all alike began to make excuse. And that's the beginning of verse 18. Then he said, the first one said, this is the first one. I have bought a piece of land, and I need to go out and look at it. Please consider me excused. Now, most Bible students know what the Lord is talking about here. We don't have to think very long and very hard to understand. This big dinner is the spiritual feast in his kingdom. What he's offering at the spiritual table of the blessings of God in him, that's the feast. For those who would become disciples and sit at his table and feast upon this big dinner, as he calls it. Well, can you imagine? One of them said, who had already been invited and was coming said, I can't. Because I bought a piece of land and need, you notice I have the word need underlined, to go and look at it. Please have me excused. So in other words, this is not a justifiable reason. It's something that he made up in order to avoid accountability, to avoid the invitation and be excused acceptably. And so what is this? Well, really what he's telling us, this is a category of things the Lord is teaching of something that becomes more compelling. I need to do this. I have to do this. And what the Lord is wanting us to understand, that's not a justifiable reason for not accepting his invitation. What should be a justifiable, a compelling reason? There's nothing more compelling. There's nothing that should pull us with any stronger power than what the Lord wants us to do. And in verse 19, another one, this is the second, said, I have bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I'm going to try them out. Please consider me excused. So you can understand this man's excitement. He must have been a big farmer. To buy 5 yoke, that's 10 new animals. And so I have just bought them. I'm going to try them out. Instead of coming to your big dinner that you've invited me to, that I said I would be there, I'm going to go and try these 5 yoke of oxen out. So in other words, what he's telling them, I'd rather do that than come to your house. I'd rather do that than come to your feast. There's something I would rather do. So that's a big category of things. A lot of things can be in that category for us. But that's what this man said. Of course, you think about, this is something he made up. He didn't have to do that then. We know that. We could go into all of that, those kinds of things. But there's one more. Another one said, I married a wife, and for that reason, I can't come. So in other words, what he's doing is that something's happened that is preventing me. Well, sometimes that actually does happen. Something happens beyond our control that is a justifiable reason that we can't. But this man, he's making that up. He's invented that to avoid embarrassment or accountability or displeasure from this man for not coming to his feast. Well, perhaps he's appealing to the Old Testament law. In Deuteronomy chapter 24, and I believe it's verse 5, the law of Moses said that a man that was newly married was exempt for a year from going to war or from doing business. In other words, that allowed him time for a whole year to be exempt from military service or from doing business. That's the law of Moses. And this man may have said, well, maybe I can use that to kind of make it sound like, well, no, you don't have a justifiable reason here. In fact, let's argue with this man. If you want to do what's right, you would have taken her. Because the end of that statement in Deuteronomy 24, verse 5, says that the reason for this law is that you may please your wife. You give her your time and attention for an entire year before you ever think about going to war or doing business to please her. Well, if he wanted to please his wife, truly he was just married, he would have taken her to this feast. She would have been welcome. But the point is, what Jesus is doing in this example is showing us a category of excuses that people sometimes make. Something has happened to prevent me. I can't because this is holding me back and preventing me. So let's take a look at each of these invited guests. And these are excuses. Let's give them the weight that they deserve. These are from the mouth of Jesus. These are invented reasons that he taught, that came from the mouth of people who didn't want to accept his invitation. They came from the mouth of individuals who did not have a justifiable reason. They just didn't want to. There's something else was more compelling. I'm being driven to do that more than to accept that invitation. Or really, you get down to it, I really would rather do that than that. How often are we faced with those kinds of differentiations and saying why we don't do certain things? Sometimes it is just a fine line. But sometimes something does happen. And we'll talk about that more in just a moment. But I want to show you, I think what the Lord did is to give us some excuses that are answers that's still made today. Why aren't you becoming a Christian? Why aren't you accepting his invitation? Is something else more compelling? Is something else preferred more? Would you rather do something else than become a Christian and serve the Lord? Or has something really happened in your life to prevent? You see, there are a number of things that can be considered, but there is no justifiable reason. None. Why aren't you being a more faithful Christian? Any of us could be asked this question. I'm not saying this applies to all of us, but it's a question in general. Why aren't you being more faithful than you are? Well, we stammer, we stutter, and we come up with, there's no justifiable reason. You have to come up with something. And I would guarantee, most likely, it's going to be in the category of one of those excuses that the Lord taught. Why aren't you studying your Bible more? Sometimes we as Christians get a little negligent and indifferent about that Bible. We're not studying the Bible as we should. We know we should. We know better. But, okay. First of all, there's no justifiable reason. But I'm busy. I have so many things to do. I just don't have time. Well, does that mean something else is more compelling? Does that mean something else is preferred more than reading your Bible? Or has something really happened on any given day? Something can happen. We have some things that happen unexpectedly, beyond our control. That does take a lot of our time. We know that happens. And it may have interrupted our Bible study on any given day. But why don't you spend more time in prayer? Again, kind of some of the same reasons. I just don't think it's important. I don't think about it. I don't seem to have time or a frame of mind that will draw me close to God. You see, something feel more compelling. Something is preferred more if you have a block of time and you could give that time to prayer, but there's something else. Which do you prefer to do? Or something has happened to prevent. That's another possibility here too. But let's make sure that if something happens, that it's a justifiable. I don't mean justified just by you or by me in our own life, but justified by the Lord. That he will accept it. That's what counts. When you stand in the day of judgment, justifiable to him. Why is Jesus not your number one priority in life? I have family. I have so many things that are important to me. I have priorities. My priorities have been the same for years. But why is Jesus not your number one priority? Well, see, we could go on down the list. We don't have time. That's why this lesson, this subject, is so broad and so general and so comprehensive in this. But these examples from the Old Testament from Moses, from the New Testament in Luke 14 from the Lord, are kind of 6 excuses that you can read in your Bible that are representative of stuff that we may hear every day. In fact, some things that we may say every day. And so we learn from them. And just mark it down. There's not a justifiable reason among them. Well, let's look at some observations as we come to the end of our study. Pretexting is a basic form of dishonesty. Let's say it like it is. Now, don't misread that. I'm not saying texting. That's not what that's. We all text, some more than others, but we all text. This says pretexting, and there's a difference. We explained that difference at the beginning, but if I have a justifiable reason and I'm honest and say what it is and it's true, but if I have to make something up, if I have to invent something, it's not really true, is it? So I'm being a little deceitful and a little dishonest. Can we do that and be pleasing and acceptable to God? That's why this subject, I think, needs to be thought about and considered. What made me think about it in my own life, and I hope what I'm saying will help you think about it in yours. But a pretext, in other words, an excuse, does not remove accountability. We need to remember that. A justifiable reason, an act of God, or whatever we may call it, the providence of God caused me to have a flat tire, or it happened that way, and we just didn't make it to services that morning. We were on our way, and something happened. Prevented. Okay, that's honest. But why weren't you at church today? Well, there's no really justifiable. I just didn't want to go. I'm not just not feeling like it today. You know, any number of things we could say. Well, that's not really being honest with God. You may think that's good or justifiable, but not. But a key to avoiding this problem is our priorities and our want to. When you think about it, this is what it comes down to, and I've said at the beginning, this is a problem to be avoided. How do I avoid the problem of making excuses? Well, one of the ways is to make sure that my priorities are right and my want to is where it should be. It is a principle of human psychology. You know this principle. I know this principle. Whether we know it or not, we probably live by it every day. It says, if it is important to you, you will find a way. If not, you will find an excuse. In other words, there's something that you should be doing, something to do, something, well, it doesn't seem like you're going to be able to do it. It's not certain, but it looks like I'm not going to be able to do that. Well, how important is it? If it's important enough, whether it's a planned trip or we could go down the list of all sorts of possibilities, and it's important enough to you, you will find a way. You will do it, if at all possible. But if not, then we have to start thinking about and inventing. This is just a principle of human psychology. So my exhortation in the closing part of this sermon this morning, let us make sure that what the Lord wants us to do is important enough to find a way. But I can't. But there are things, yes, but how important is it to you to do what the Lord wants you to do? Are you going to put your priorities over His? What is more compelling to you over His? If what the Lord wants us to do is important enough, We value it like it should be valued. An all-important value to us in going to heaven, then we will find a way. Whether it's reading the Bible, whether it's spending time in prayer, whether it's encouraging others, whether it's attending worship, whether it's attending Bible class, or whatever it may be, the Lord wants us to do, we will find a way. If it's important enough, and if it's what we want to do. So we need to work on our priorities and our desire. But finding a way will avoid the problem, avoid excuses, and have us serving the Lord faithfully. As we close our lesson today and prepare to sing this invitation song, we trust that each of us can think about excuses in our own life. And if we have a problem, overcome the problem. If future, try to avoid making excuses and just simply be honest and try to do what we should always be doing so that we don't have to make excuses. But if you're here today and you're not a Christian, we want you to know that you're invited to that big dinner that the Lord talked about, to that feast, that spiritual feast. All things are ready, we sing. Come to the feast. Okay, that's what the invitation is. That's what the Lord wants you to do. Well, then if you're subject to the invitation, this is your opportunity to do that this morning. We're set and prepared to do what is necessary for you to become a Christian, a disciple of Christ. If you're an erring Christian, if you have sinned so as to separate between you and God, then we stand ready to help you with that by going to God in prayer. Please let us know while together we stand and sing.